Hi, everybody. My name is Bobby Harrington, and I have the privilege of being the point leader of Discipleship.org. At Discipleship.org, we champion Jesus' method of disciple making, and we also look forward to the day when Jesus-style disciple making is the norm in homes, in communities, in churches, and in networks. So I hope you'll be encouraged to adopt Jesus-style disciple making. So a few years ago, when we were looking at how to encourage and help people with disciple making, we realized that it would be helpful if we could have an objective assessment of how a person is doing as a disciple maker. And so what we were able to do, and we did this in partnership with Discipleship.org and Exponential, is we brought together some of the nation's leading disciple making experts. So we're talking about people like Jim Putman and Ralph Moore and Robbie Gallaty. We got the input of a veteran, Robert Coleman, who wrote the gold standard on Jesus-style disciple making in the 1960s, where he described how Jesus made disciples. And so we got together and we said, okay, if we would use a mathematical filter on disciple making, would that be helpful? And we determined that it would be helpful. And so when I say a mathematical disciple-making filter, here's what I mean. I'm going to use my hand. There are some disciple-making that literally causes the loss, so subtraction of disciples and disciple-making processes. There is some disciple-making that individuals do, and it's just a plateau. You don't help people to be more devoted in following Jesus, and you don't hinder them. By the way, the definition of disciple making that we're using is built around Matthew chapter 4, and we say that a disciple is somebody who's following Jesus, being changed by Jesus, and is committed to the mission of Jesus. So when you use that filter, some of it's subtraction, some of it's just plateauing, some of it is addition. In other words, churches that have good sermons and good programs, they help add disciples. People will make commitments to follow Jesus, but they'll also grow in certain ways. So it's addition. But when you look at the Bible and you say, what is the focus of really reproducing disciples, the way Jesus reproduced disciples, it's personal relationships. It's not depending on a church, but it's depending on an individual who will make disciples. So individual disciple makers are literally reproducing disciples. And then there are those people who don't just make disciples, but they're level 5. They make disciple makers. So Paul in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2 says to Timothy, he says, Timothy, that which you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable people who are able to teach others. So what Paul envisions there is literally 4 generations of disciples. There's Paul to Timothy, Timothy to reliable people, and then reliable people disciple others. And so we worked to create this tool. Now, here's how it happened. We brought these experts together. Everybody prepared before we set about the task of discussing how we would use that mathematical framework to look at disciple making. And then we spent the day, we would chart out activities that we have seen in our churches and with people in our disciple making movements, and we would understand the character traits that typify these. And it actually worked out super well together. And so at the end of the day, we collated everything, and then we did a statistical evaluation. We worked with Greg Wines, who's an expert, doctoral level expert on statistics, and we used what the group had created, and we had literally hundreds of people take the assessment to see how it works. And again, we're gauging, I just want to reiterate the mathematical basis that we're using at Discipleship.org and Exponential. As an individual, am I causing a decline in disciple making, a subtraction? Am I causing a plateau? Or am I contributing what we call level 3, which is basically church programs are adding disciples? Or are we creating people who personally will disciple and reproduce disciples? Or, and this is the highest goal in terms of replicating what Jesus did or what Paul did, and that is we don't just make disciples, but level 5, we make disciple makers. In fact, what we argue is that people who are privileged to be on staff at a church should see that their role is not just to make disciples, but to start a movement of disciple making. Their role would be to make disciple makers. Because for every disciple maker that you make, they are making disciples who make disciples. And the vision that we commend to everyone is this 4 generations of disciples from disciple-making activities. Now, sometimes people ask, why is it important to know your level? It's important to know your level because intentionality really helps you to get better at it. You say, well, intentionality, what do you mean? Intentionality is being purposive, or it's having a mindset with a goal in mind. I have an intention to help someone follow Jesus, be changed by Jesus, and join the mission of Jesus. Or I have the intention of raising up disciple makers who help make disciples like I've just described. And here's the interesting thing. Once you understand the dynamics of being a disciple who makes disciples and also making disciple makers, it actually helps you to become more effective at it. It's the whole idea that intentionality means learning skills, making commitments to certain practices, and then those practices help you to get better and better at it. It's actually like many other things in life. You become a better bricklayer by actually practicing laying bricks and learning the techniques. I grew up in a truck driver family, so truck drivers are often become really good truck drivers when they are mentored and discipled in certain basic skills and abilities. And really, that's what disciple making is. And disciple making churches have simple, effective, reproducible models of disciple making that people are intentionally trained in, and then they intentionally develop them. Now, when we developed the assessment, the Level 5 Disciple Making Assessment, the thing that surprised us was, and this just really stood out after we did the first couple of 100 beta tests, is the very few number of people who actually aspired not just to make disciples, but to make disciple makers. And we realized that actually that's what Jesus did. Jesus didn't just make disciples. Like when you think of Peter, James, and John, what was Jesus doing? Was he just making them to be disciples and it ended with them? No. Jesus modeled for them and then commanded them to go and make disciples of others as he had made disciples of them. So the biggest surprise was the few number of people who actually think that way and then committed their lives to be like that. Now, the most common misunderstanding in disciple making is that it just happens. A lot of people will say, well, disciple making is organic and relational, and that is absolutely true. But it's not just organic and relational. Disciple making is also highly intentional. You have to go about a plan and a strategy to help someone to become fully devoted to Jesus and to make disciples like Jesus. I like to tease people with a question. I say, was Jesus intentionally organic, or was he organically intentional? And I say it that way because both things are true. It's intentionality and it's relationship. Now, I'm often asked, what is the role of the assessment in disciple making? Well, in my work at Discipleship.org, we actually developed a process of training people in a very specific disciple-making model that's just kind of this practical, simple, effective, reproducible model, and then coaching them through the process by having them take the assessment, seeing where they're at, then giving them a specific model. And by the way, there's not just one model. It could be Discovery Bible Study. It could be this Trust and Follow Jesus material that I've developed. But when you coach people on exactly how to do it, you have them take the assessment, which will identify where they're strong and where they're weak, and then you coach them to get to that next level. So oftentimes it's a level 3 person who's helping the church to make disciples, and we challenge them and say, hey, how about you personally get involved in personally discipling people regularly? So we challenge them to go from level 3 to level 4, and then they personally make disciples. And then the next biggest challenge we find is people who are in leadership at a church or in a ministry, and we challenge them, don't just make disciples. Think long term. Think 4 generations. Go from level 4 to level 5, where you're like Paul told Timothy, of making disciples who make disciples. Now, when we look at the North American landscape, when it comes to disciple making, we're in a very interesting time of change. We don't know what the future holds in terms of pandemics and the economy, but we know this, that church and church life is radically changing. Here's the good news. No matter what changes there are, whether it's changes that are really disruptive or not, Jesus-style disciple making never is out of vogue. We can always go back and make disciples the way Jesus made them. In fact, I would argue in this time, as much as any time in history, we need people who are focused on Jesus' method of making disciples. Robert Coleman, who helped us with the original assessment, likes to say it this way: Jesus' method of disciple making was the perfect method. And you know, when I first heard him say that, I thought, that sounds like a Sunday school statement. Like, yeah, that's supposed to be true, but like, isn't that an overstatement? And then the more I looked at how Jesus made disciples, I actually became convinced that Coleman is right. I mean, think about it. In the person of Jesus, Colossians tells us, dwelt all of God's wisdom and knowledge. Or Dallas Willard's statement that Jesus was the most brilliant person to ever live, which is obviously true since he was the Son of God. And so Jesus, with all of his brilliance, made disciples in what surely had to be the best way. And let me just say this, it's not only a first century way of making disciples, but it is the way human beings are wired to need disciple making. You see, Jesus was highly relational, highly intentional. It was life on life. It was as they walked along the road, as the disciples would lie down, when they would get up, when they would deal with things, Jesus would walk them through it. It's teachings that were hard teachings that maybe they didn't want to hear, but they needed to hear. And so his method, Jesus' method, is simply the most important method that a church or individuals could ever adopt. So my advice to you is to have your people, first for yourself, take this assessment, see how you do, pray about it, ask God to show you how you can become more effective, and then in becoming more effective, help others to take this tool, assess themselves to become better disciple makers. This level 5 framework that you'll find in the assessment and in the ebook that we wrote entitled Becoming a Disciple Maker, this model and this assessment, you will find it to be very helpful in establishing in your own life, in your ministry, and if you can influence your whole church, it will help you to focus on doing what Jesus did, and that is to invest in making disciples who then went on to make other disciples. And where we're seeing rapid expansion of the kingdom of God in international disciple-making movements and in those movements in North America where there are signs of disciple-making movements, or disciple-making practices that become the DNA. It's this framework where everybody sees it, that their role is to be disciples who make disciples and who help disciple-making movements. So I want to encourage you to jump in, join with us, learn what you can, and become a better disciple maker.